In 1933, when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, the Third Reich did not begin rewriting history with bombs or borders. It began with paper. That year, German school children opened newly approved textbooks. On the surface, nothing looked radical. The paper was clean. The maps were neatly colored. The language was calm, authoritative, factual. There were no screaming slogans, no threats, no visible hatred. What made these books dangerous was precisely that they looked normal. A map does not argue. A textbook does not shout. They simply state. And once something is printed, especially for a child, it stops feeling like an opinion. It becomes reality. By the mid-1930s, German classrooms were filled with atlases that showed borders no historian had ever recognized. Eastern Europe appeared vague, underdeveloped, oddly empty. Poland was depicted as an artificial construction. Ukraine barely existed as a historical subject at all. These were not mistakes, they were design choices. At the same time, history lessons were quietly reorganized. Germany's past was no longer a sequence of debates, failures, and competing interpretations. It became a single, uninterrupted narrative of victimhood and destiny. Wars were never acts of aggression. They were responses. Expansion was never conquest. It was correction. Neighbors were not nations. They were temporary occupants of land that history itself had supposedly misallocated. This was not propaganda in the loud sense. It was something more precise. The Nazi state understood a simple principle long before the first tank crossed a border. If you want obedience tomorrow, you must control memory today. Children learned geography and history as one combined lesson. The map on the wall confirmed what the textbook explained. The textbook explained what the map already seemed to prove. There was no contradiction to resolve, only repetition. And repetition, especially in childhood, does not feel like indoctrination. It feels like truth. By the time the war began in 1939, millions of Germans did not believe they were invading foreign lands. According to the maps they had studied and the history they had memorized, they were merely stepping back into a distorted version of the past, one that had been carefully drawn, printed, and taught years earlier. This story is not about forged documents or secret archives. It is about classrooms, about atlases, about lessons that replaced history with certainty. And it begins with a map. Because once a map is accepted, the future no longer needs to be justified. In the early years of the Third Reich, maps became one of the most quietly radical tools of the regime. They did not announce themselves as propaganda. They did not carry swastikas on every corner. Instead, they entered German life disguised as science, geography, and education, especially in schools. By 1934, the Reich Ministry of Education, under Bernhard Rust, had approved a new generation of school atlases. These books were presented as modern, objective, and academically sound. Teachers were instructed to treat them as authoritative. Parents rarely questioned them. After all, maps were supposed to be neutral. They were anything but. One of the most important conceptual tricks used by Nazi cartographers was the idea of historical geography. Students were taught that political borders were temporary, artificial, and often unjust, while ethnic or racial space was presented as permanent and natural. Maps published between 1935 and 1939 increasingly blurred the line between medieval territorial claims, early modern migrations, and contemporary state borders. Germany's eastern neighbors, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, and especially Ukraine, were rarely shown as sovereign historical actors. Instead, atlases emphasized vague zones labeled Ostrom, Eastern Space, or Siedlungsgebiete der Deutschen, German settlement areas, even when these claims were centuries old or historically contested. In many school atlases, medieval German trading routes or isolated settler communities were highlighted in bold colors, while entire Slavic populations were visually minimized or omitted. The implication was subtle but powerful. If Germans had once been there, then Germans belong there again. Poland received particularly aggressive cartographic treatment. After the German invasion in September 1939, new maps were rushed into circulation for classrooms. These maps portrayed Poland not as a nation that had existed for centuries, but as an unstable political experiment imposed by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Earlier, Polish-Lithuanian history was either ignored or dismissed as irrelevant. Atlases emphasized that Poland's borders were unnatural, its ethnic composition was chaotic, and its statehood was recent and artificial. By contrast, German territorial claims were depicted as historically continuous, stretching backward in time as far as possible. This visual asymmetry mattered. Children learned to associate German borders with depth and legitimacy, and Polish borders with accident and error. If Poland was presented as an inconvenience, Ukraine was often treated as something even less tangible, a space without history. In many Nazi school maps, Ukraine appeared without a clear national narrative, without historical state continuity, and without political legitimacy. Instead, it was framed primarily as agricultural land, resource territory, and future settlement space. The message was never stated explicitly in classrooms, but it was unmistakable in visual terms. Ukraine was not shown as a nation that could be conquered. It was shown as a space that could be used. This cartographic logic aligned perfectly with Generalplan Ost, the secret but systematic blueprint developed between 1940 and 1942 for the colonization of Eastern Europe. While Generalplan Ost was not publicly taught in schools, its assumptions were already being normalized through maps years earlier. When mass deportations and extermination policies began, they did not contradict what many young Germans had learned. They fulfilled it. Another crucial feature of Nazi maps was linguistic framing. Borders were not described as expanded or seized. They were corrected. Territories were not taken. They were reintegrated. This language appeared not only in speeches, but directly in map legends, captions, and accompanying textbooks. For example, Austria's annexation in 1938 was shown as Heimkehr ins Reich, a return home. The Sudetenland was depicted as a German island, unfairly separated from the mainland. Later maps implied that Eastern expansion was a continuation of the same historical logic. By the time students encountered real military maps during the war, the psychological groundwork had already been laid. The idea of Germany advancing eastward no longer felt aggressive. It felt inevitable. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Nazi cartography was not what it showed, but what it removed. Human populations rarely appeared as people. Instead, villages became dots, regions became color blocks, entire ethnic groups disappeared into abstraction. Jews, Roma, Slavs, millions of individuals were reduced to nothing more than demographic obstacles, if they appeared at all. By stripping maps of human presence, the regime made future violence easier to imagine. You cannot feel empathy for a color gradient. This was not accidental. Nazi geographers openly discussed the need to represent space in ways that emphasized usability, productivity, and racial potential rather than existing communities. Geography was redefined as a tool of planning, not understanding. What made all of this so effective was repetition. A German child in the late 1930s would see these maps in school, copy them into notebooks, answer exam questions based on them, and hear teachers reinforce their logic. There was no competing atlas, no alternative curriculum. Foreign maps were banned. Jewish and liberal publishers had already been purged after the 1933 book burnings. By adolescence, many students could no longer imagine Europe differently, not because they were forced to believe, but because they had never been shown another version. When German troops crossed borders in 1939 and 1941, they did not enter unknown worlds. They marched into places that had already been framed, labeled, and morally prepared on classroom walls years earlier. The map had done its work. It had transformed invasion into restoration, violence into administration, and mass displacement into geographic logic. And it had accomplished all of this without shouting, threatening, or arguing, only by being printed, approved, and taught. If the map trained the eye, the school textbook trained the mind. By the mid-1930s, the Nazi leadership understood that no territorial ambition could survive on military force alone. Borders could be crossed by armies, but they could only be accepted by populations that believed those borders made sense. For that, the regime needed something far more durable than propaganda posters or radio speeches. It needed memory, manufactured early, repeated often, and never challenged. That work was done in classrooms. In April 1933, just weeks after the Nazi seizure of power, the German education system was brought under centralized control. Universities were purged first, then secondary schools, then primary education. Teachers deemed politically unreliable were dismissed. Jewish educators were removed almost immediately. By 1935, loyalty to the regime was a prerequisite for teaching history at any level. Under the authority of the Reich Ministry of Science, Education, and Culture, all history textbooks were reviewed, rewritten, or replaced. This was not a cosmetic revision. Entire interpretive frameworks were discarded. Older textbooks that described Germany's responsibility in World War I, internal political conflict, social movements, or pluralistic interpretations of the past were labeled undeutsch, un-German. In their place came a new genre of educational material. These books were thinner, more direct, and ideologically unified. They removed complexity. They removed contradiction. Most importantly, they removed doubt. By 1936, a German child encountered the same historical storyline at every level of education. The structure was always familiar. Germany was presented as an ancient people whose natural development had been repeatedly interrupted by foreign forces. Roman influence was framed as contamination. Christianity was treated cautiously, often subordinated to racial identity. The medieval Holy Roman Empire was depicted as an early, imperfect expression of German destiny. Fragmentation and internal diversity were portrayed as weakness. Modern history followed the same logic. The defeat of 1918 was never explained through military exhaustion or strategic failure. Instead, it was attributed to betrayal, internal decay, and manipulation by enemies within. The Treaty of Versailles was described not as a political agreement, but as an act of violence committed through paper rather than weapons. Democracy was not debated, it was dismissed. Students were taught that parliamentary systems were inherently unstable, foreign in origin, and incompatible with German character. Elections were described as spectacles rather than mechanisms of legitimacy. Political pluralism was portrayed as confusion. What replaced these concepts was not analysis, but inevitability. History, according to the new textbooks, did not branch. It flowed in one direction, toward restoration. One of the most striking features of Nazi schoolbooks was their tone. They did not read like manifestos. They avoided emotional excess. Instead, they adopted the language of inevitability and nature. Events were described as outcomes rather than decisions. Violence was abstracted, agency was blurred. For example, wars broke out rather than being started. Borders shifted rather than being seized. Populations moved rather than being expelled. This linguistic strategy mattered. By removing verbs of responsibility, the textbooks removed moral friction. Students learned history as a sequence of processes rather than choices. There was no need to justify aggression if aggression appeared as the natural correction of imbalance. Unlike earlier nationalist curricula, Nazi textbooks rarely personalized enemies. There were few named villains. Instead, antagonists appeared as forces, tendencies, or conditions. Jews were not presented as individuals, but as abstractions: economic influence, cultural distortion, internal danger. Slavic peoples were described demographically rather than culturally. Western powers were framed as hypocritical systems rather than political actors. This abstraction served two purposes. First, it reduced empathy. Second, it allowed violence to be framed as technical necessity rather than moral decision. You do not negotiate with abstractions, you manage them. The most aggressive historical simplifications appeared in materials designed for children aged 6 to 10. At this level, textbooks emphasized visual storytelling, simplified timelines, heroic continuity, and repetition. Illustrations showed ancient Germans as tall, disciplined, and orderly. Modern Germans were depicted in the same posture, the same scale, the same symbolic colors. History collapsed into a single identity, stretched across centuries. Importantly, children were rarely taught dates in isolation. Dates were attached to meaning. Certain years were framed as wounds, others as corrections. 1918 was not a military defeat. It was a rupture. 1933 was not a political change. It was a renewal. By the time students reached adolescence, these associations were automatic. The power of the system lay not only in what was taught, but in how learning was evaluated. Students were examined not on interpretation, but on recognition. Essay questions rewarded alignment, not originality. Teachers were encouraged to correct not only factual errors, but ideological deviations. A student who questioned causality was not marked as curious, but as confused. Over time, the safest way to succeed academically was to internalize the approved narrative completely. Critical thinking was not forbidden outright. It was simply rendered irrelevant. Foreign perspectives did not exist. Translations of foreign historical works were banned. International scholarship was dismissed as politically contaminated. Comparative history disappeared from curricula. For a German student graduating in 1938, the world's past existed only in one version, the version printed by the state. This isolation was crucial. Propaganda can be resisted if alternatives are visible. Education cannot if no alternatives are allowed to exist. By the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, an entire generation had already been educated into acceptance. They did not see the war as a rupture. They saw it as confirmation. The maps they had studied explained where Germany belonged. The textbooks they had memorized explained why it had been wronged. The exams they had passed rewarded the correct conclusions. Nothing about the invasion contradicted what they had learned. The classroom had already done what the battlefield would later enforce. The most dangerous achievement of the Nazi education system was not indoctrination, it was normalization. Once an idea becomes normal, it no longer requires defense. Once a narrative is accepted as common sense, resistance appears irrational. By turning history education into a factory of memory, standardized, synchronized, and sealed, the Third Reich ensured that when violence arrived, it would feel not radical, but reasonable. The textbooks did not call for war. They simply made war intelligible. What made the Nazi system uniquely effective was not the map alone, and not the textbook alone, but the way both were synchronized into a single, closed reality. Each reinforced the other so perfectly that contradiction became almost impossible to perceive. A child did not learn history first and geography later, or question one with the help of the other. The lesson was always simultaneous. The same story appeared everywhere, in the same language, with the same assumptions, until it no longer felt like a story at all. In a typical German classroom in 1937 or 1938, A large wall map of Europe hung behind the teacher's desk. It showed Germany at the center, cleanly defined, solid, visually dominant. To the east, borders softened, colors faded, labels grew abstract. The visual hierarchy was unmistakable. Germany was sharp and legible. Everything beyond it looked provisional. When the teacher opened the approved history textbook, the narrative aligned perfectly with what the students were already seeing. The book explained why those borders were unstable. The map silently confirmed it. This was not coincidence. The Reich Ministry of Education coordinated curriculum design so that geography lessons and history lessons followed the same ideological rhythm. A lesson on medieval German settlement patterns would be followed by a map exercise highlighting the same regions. A chapter on the Treaty of Versailles would be paired with an atlas showing Germany constricted and unnaturally divided. Students were not asked whether these representations were accurate. Accuracy was assumed by repetition. The same synchronization extended beyond formal schooling. Youth organizations, such as the Hitler Youth, used simplified maps and historical summaries that mirrored classroom materials almost exactly. Weekend activities included map-reading exercises framed as games, hikes that reinforced territorial imagination, and lectures that reused textbook phrasing word for word. A boy who left school at noon and attended Hitler Youth activities in the afternoon encountered no conceptual shift. The same Germany followed him everywhere. This consistency mattered more than intensity. The regime did not need to persuade children every day. It needed only to ensure that no alternative interpretation ever appeared. When all inputs agree, belief becomes automatic. A student could forget dates or names, but the underlying structure of reality remained intact. One of the most effective aspects of this synchronization was the way it erased the idea of contingency. History was not taught as a sequence of decisions made by people who could have chosen differently. It was taught as a process unfolding according to internal laws. The map showed natural spaces. The textbook described natural developments. Together, they implied that outcomes were inevitable. If borders changed, it was because history demanded it. If populations moved, it was because geography required it. This approach dissolved moral responsibility without ever mentioning morality. A child looking at a map that presented Eastern Europe as a vast underutilized space did not need to be told that displacement was acceptable. The conclusion suggested itself. Space that appeared empty or chaotic invited order. Order required administration. Administration required authority. Authority required expansion. Each step followed logically from the previous one, even though the human cost was never shown. The power of synchronization also lay in how it handled complexity. Instead of confronting difficult historical realities, the system distributed fragments of explanation across different media. A textbook might mention that borders in the East had changed frequently. A map would show overlapping historical claims without explaining them. A teacher would summarize the situation as historically unresolved. None of these elements alone constituted a lie. Together, they created a misleading clarity. Complexity was not denied. It was neutralized. Examinations reinforced this unity. Geography tests required students to reproduce maps from memory. History exams asked them to explain why certain territorial outcomes were justified. The correct answer in one subject presupposed the conclusions of the other. A student who internalized the logic of the map would naturally succeed in the history exam. A student who questioned the map would struggle in both. By the late 1930s, this educational environment produced a generation that did not experience ideology as ideology. It experienced it as coherence. Everything fit together. There were no loose ends to pull at, no contradictions to explore. Even skepticism had nowhere to attach itself. The synchronization extended into language itself. The same phrases appeared across subjects. Words like correction, restoration, space, and order migrated seamlessly between maps, textbooks, classroom lectures, and youth materials. Language became the glue that held visual and narrative elements together. When students later encountered these terms in speeches or newspapers, they already understood them intuitively. The words did not provoke reflection. They activated recognition. Crucially, the system also controlled silence. Certain questions simply never arose because the materials did not create the conditions for asking them. Why did other nations see borders differently? Why did people live in regions described as empty? Why did history appear to move in only one direction? These questions required exposure to alternative frameworks that were deliberately absent. Foreign maps were banned from schools. International textbooks were inaccessible. Even older German materials were quietly withdrawn. The educational past was erased as thoroughly as the political one. A student graduating in 1939 had no memory of having learned anything different. This is why later claims that ordinary Germans did not know are both true and misleading. They did not know because knowing required conceptual tools they had never been given. Their education had not simply supplied answers, it had structured the range of imaginable questions. When war began, synchronization reached its final stage. Military maps looked familiar. The names of regions matched what students had memorized. The direction of advance corresponded to the natural movement they had seen implied for years. Even violence followed expectation. It was not a rupture of the world they knew, but an extension of it. This is the quiet danger of synchronized knowledge systems. They do not need to suppress dissent actively. They preempt it by designing reality so that dissent feels incoherent. When the map and the textbook speak with one voice, disagreement sounds like ignorance rather than courage. By the time Germany crossed its neighbors' borders, the most important conquest had already taken place. It had happened in classrooms, in notebooks, in the unchallenged alignment of images and words. The future had been rehearsed long before it was enacted. The synchronization did not tell children to support war. It did something more effective. It made war make sense. The Nazi system of historical manipulation worked not because it was loud, but because it was quiet. Not because it overwhelmed people with constant agitation, but because it removed the conditions under which doubt could exist. It did not demand belief. It arranged reality so that belief became the default setting. At the center of this success was authority. In the Third Reich, authority was not limited to political leadership or police power. It permeated everyday structures that had long been trusted: schools, textbooks, maps, exams, and teachers. These were institutions that parents respected and children obeyed instinctively. When information came from these sources, it carried a legitimacy that propaganda posters could never achieve. A map on a classroom wall did not feel ideological. It felt technical. It appeared to reflect reality rather than interpret it. A textbook did not present itself as a political argument. It presented itself as accumulated knowledge, distilled and stabilized. Together, these objects benefited from centuries of cultural trust. The Nazi regime did not need to invent new tools. It only needed to repurpose old ones. The system also worked because it targeted children at precisely the stage when cognitive frameworks are still forming. Young students are not natural skeptics. They learn by pattern recognition and repetition. When the same ideas appear across different contexts, visual, textual, spoken, and evaluated, the brain stops treating them as propositions and begins treating them as facts. Once that threshold is crossed, unlearning becomes extremely difficult. By controlling both content and evaluation, the regime ensured that intellectual survival depended on conformity. Exams did not reward curiosity. They rewarded alignment. Teachers were not trained to foster debate, but to enforce coherence. Over time, this reshaped not only what students believed, but how they learned to think. Independent analysis was not punished explicitly. It simply became useless. Another reason the system succeeded was its strategic use of abstraction. Violence was rarely described in personal terms. Borders moved, populations shifted, systems collapsed. People disappeared into passive constructions. This grammatical distancing mattered. It allowed students to process catastrophic events without emotional engagement. When suffering is described as a process rather than an experience, moral response is delayed, sometimes indefinitely. The absence of faces was just as important as the presence of symbols. Jews, Slavs, Roma, and other targeted groups appeared as categories, not communities. They were statistics, problems, or influences. This abstraction made later atrocities cognitively compatible with what had already been learned. The victims did not feel real because they had never been introduced as real in the first place. The regime also understood the importance of narrative closure. Open-ended histories invite interpretation, closed histories enforce conclusion. Nazi textbooks rarely ended chapters with unresolved questions or debates. They ended with outcomes that appeared final and justified. Each historical episode led naturally into the next, forming a seamless progression toward the present. The message was implicit but unmistakable. History had already decided. This sense of inevitability removed the burden of choice. If events unfold according to historical necessity, individual responsibility dissolves. Actions become participation in a larger process rather than moral decisions. This framing did not require citizens to be cruel. It only required them to be compliant. Social reinforcement amplified the effect. Students learned the same material at the same time, repeated it to one another, and received approval for correct reproduction. Deviance stood out immediately, not as courage, but as confusion. Peer pressure did not need to be orchestrated. It emerged naturally in a system where consensus was built into the structure. The integration of education with youth organizations further sealed the environment. The Hitler Youth did not introduce new ideas. It rehearsed existing ones in different settings. Marches, camps, and group activities reinforced the same spatial and historical imagination that students encountered in classrooms. Leisure time did not provide escape from ideology. It extended it. Crucially, the regime eliminated comparative perspective. There was no sense that history could be told differently elsewhere. Foreign interpretations were not debated or even mentioned. Without comparison, there was no reason to suspect distortion. A student cannot recognize bias if bias is all they have ever known. This isolation created what might be called intellectual monoculture. Ideas did not compete. They accumulated. Each repetition strengthened the structure rather than testing it. Over time, even obvious contradictions were absorbed rather than challenged. Reality bent to fit the narrative, not the other way around. The system also benefited from gradualism. Changes were introduced incrementally. No single textbook revision appeared shocking on its own. Each edition shifted emphasis slightly, adjusted terminology, simplified explanation. Parents who might have objected to sudden radicalization often did not notice slow transformation. By the time the system reached full coherence, resistance felt anachronistic. Fear played a role, but it was not the primary mechanism. Most students did not internalize the Nazi worldview because they were afraid. They internalized it because it was the only worldview available. Coercion enforces obedience. Monopoly shapes belief. By the late 1930s, the regime no longer needed to justify its actions extensively. Its citizens had been prepared to accept them as logical consequences of what they already knew. When Germany expanded eastward, many did not experience moral shock. They experienced recognition. The maps matched, the textbooks aligned. The story made sense. This is why post-war denazification faced such deep challenges. Removing symbols was easy. Removing internalized frameworks was not. People could reject Hitler and still retain the mental structures that had made his policies seem reasonable. Education had done its work too well. The most disturbing lesson of this system is that it did not rely on extraordinary evil. It relied on ordinary processes: schooling, testing, standardization, repetition. It turned everyday pedagogy into infrastructure for mass compliance. The Nazi regime demonstrated that the most effective way to control a population is not to dictate what it must believe, but to shape the environment in which belief forms. When authority speaks through trusted institutions, when alternatives are absent, and when repetition replaces debate, even the most radical distortions can feel normal. The classroom did not produce monsters. It produced certainty, and certainty, when detached from reality, can be far more dangerous. The most uncomfortable truth about the Nazi manipulation of maps and textbooks is not how extreme it was, but how transferable it proved to be. The Third Reich did not invent the technique. It refined it, synchronized it, and demonstrated how effective it could be. Other states watched. Some learned. Many applied the same logic under different flags, with different enemies, and in different historical contexts, but always with the same core assumption: control the map, control the lesson, and time will do the rest. In Fascist Italy, the mechanism appeared almost immediately after Benito Mussolini consolidated power in the mid-1920s. Italian schoolchildren were taught to see themselves not merely as citizens of a modern nation-state, but as biological and historical heirs to the Roman Empire. This was not presented as metaphor. It was framed as continuity. Textbooks emphasized Roman roads, Roman law, Roman order, and then quietly collapsed the centuries between antiquity and the 20th century. Medieval fragmentation, regional identities, and cultural diversity were treated as interruptions rather than history. Maps reinforced the lesson. The Mediterranean was increasingly labeled and described as Mare Nostrum, our sea. Italian atlases highlighted Roman-era control while minimizing or omitting the historical claims of other civilizations. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the war was explained not as colonial aggression, but as historical restoration. Students were taught that Italy was not expanding outward, but reaching backward. The violence of conquest dissolved into the language of return. The Italian case shows an important variation on the Nazi model. Where the Third Reich emphasized racial destiny, Fascist Italy emphasized imperial inheritance. But the educational mechanism was the same. Maps suggested inevitability. Textbooks supplied justification. Children absorbed both, long before they were capable of evaluating either. In the Soviet Union, the process took a different but equally systematic form. Under Joseph Stalin, history became one of the most aggressively edited disciplines in the education system. Soviet textbooks were rewritten repeatedly throughout the 1930s and 1940s, not to refine interpretation, but to align with the current political line. Events did not change, but their meaning did. Figures who fell from favor disappeared not only from public life, but from printed history itself. Maps followed suit. Borders were redrawn retroactively to reflect contemporary power realities. Territories absorbed into the USSR were depicted as historically destined to belong there, regardless of prior sovereignty. In some cases, entire states vanished from educational maps within a single edition cycle. The Baltic countries, parts of Poland, regions of the Caucasus, all were reframed as naturally integrated spaces. Soviet children learned history not as a stable record, but as a living document subject to revision. What mattered was not truth, but correctness. The correct version was always the current one. This created a population trained not to ask whether something had happened, but whether it was presently acknowledged. Unlike Nazi Germany, the Soviet system did not emphasize inevitability rooted in race. It emphasized inevitability rooted in class struggle and historical materialism. But again, the method remained unchanged. Maps created spatial logic. Textbooks created narrative logic. Together, They made political outcomes appear historically necessary. Imperial Japan provides another revealing example. In the 1930s and early 1940s, Japanese school curricula were reoriented around the concept of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This phrase appeared repeatedly in textbooks, maps, and classroom materials. On paper, it suggested cooperation and mutual benefit. On maps, it depicted a vast region unified under Japanese leadership. The language of invasion was almost entirely absent. Expansion into China, Korea, and Southeast Asia was framed as liberation from Western imperialism. Japanese maps emphasized cultural unity, shared destiny, and regional harmony. Textbooks avoided detailed discussion of violence, occupation, or resistance. Instead, students learned about economic integration, spiritual leadership, and historical mission. Here again, abstraction did the work. War became administration. Occupation became organization. The absence of dissenting perspectives ensured that students encountered no conceptual friction. When reality contradicted the lesson remained intact. In the modern era, the same techniques have not disappeared. They have simply adapted to new political environments. In contemporary China, school maps play a central role in shaping national identity. From an early age, students are taught to recognize a specific territorial outline as natural and unquestionable. Disputed regions are included as settled facts. Alternative representations are absent. Textbooks reinforce this spatial certainty by embedding it within a historical narrative of humiliation and restoration. The lesson is subtle but persistent. Territorial claims are not presented as political positions, but as inherited realities. To question them is not to disagree, but to misunderstand. As in the Third Reich, the map does not argue. It states. Turkey offers a different but related case. For decades, Turkish school textbooks presented a vision of the nation that emphasized unity, continuity, and homogeneity. Ethnic and religious minorities appeared rarely, if at all. Events that complicated the narrative of national cohesion were reframed, softened, or omitted entirely. Maps depicted a seamless national space, while textbooks described a seamless historical identity. Students learned a version of history in which complexity was synonymous with threat. The absence of certain populations from maps and narratives was not presented as denial. It was presented as normality. What was not named gradually ceased to exist. Across these cases, the differences are obvious. Ideologies vary. Political systems diverge. Historical contexts conflict. Yet the structural similarities are impossible to ignore. In every case, the educational system did not simply transmit information. It structured perception. It determined which questions could be asked and which could not. It defined what appeared natural, what appeared artificial, and what appeared unthinkable. Maps provided the visual grammar. Textbooks provided the narrative syntax. Together, they created a closed informational ecosystem. Within that ecosystem, power did not need to justify itself constantly. It only needed to maintain coherence. This is why the technique remains so dangerous. It does not rely on censorship alone. It relies on design. It does not require citizens to be aggressive. It requires them to be accustomed. The legacy of the Nazi system is not confined to the past. It survives wherever education replaces inquiry with alignment, wherever maps precede debate, and wherever children are taught conclusions instead of questions. The lesson is not that history is always manipulated. The lesson is that manipulation works best when it looks like education. When the next generation opens a textbook and sees a map, the most important question is not what the map shows. It is what the map makes impossible to imagine. The most dangerous power of maps and textbooks is not that they lie. It is that they decide, quietly and in advance, what will later feel normal. By the time a border is crossed by soldiers, it has often already been crossed by ink. By the time violence shocks the world, it has usually been rehearsed in classrooms for years, not as cruelty, not as hatred, but as logic. The Third Reich understood this with terrifying clarity. It did not need to convince every citizen that war was good. It only needed to ensure that war made sense, and sense, once internalized, does not require persuasion. It requires only continuation. What children in Nazi Germany absorbed was not a list of commands, but a structure of perception. They learned where Germany naturally belonged. They learned which borders felt temporary and which felt eternal. They learned which peoples appeared as historical actors and which appeared as background conditions. By the time choices arrived, the framework for interpreting those choices was already in place. This is why the question, "Why did people go along with it?" so often misses the point. Going along implies a moment of conscious agreement. In reality, many people did not experience a moment of decision at all. They experienced recognition. The world unfolding around them matched the world they had been taught to expect. The map had prepared them for the future. The textbook had explained why that future was justified. What makes this mechanism especially dangerous is that it does not feel like coercion. It feels like education. It feels responsible. It feels orderly. Parents trust schools. Children trust books. Societies trust maps. These are institutions designed to stabilize reality, not distort it. When they are captured by power, resistance becomes unusually difficult, not because people are afraid, but because they are certain. Certainty is the true product of manipulated education. Certainty that borders are obvious. Certainty that history flows in one direction. Certainty that some questions do not need to be asked. Once certainty replaces curiosity, moral imagination collapses. Alternatives stop appearing. Empathy becomes conditional. Violence no longer looks like a rupture of order, but a restoration of it. The examples beyond Nazi Germany make this even clearer. Different regimes, different ideologies, different enemies, yet the same educational architecture, the same reliance on visual authority, the same narrative compression, the same removal of ambiguity. Again and again, the lesson is repeated. When power controls how children learn to see space and time, it controls how adults later understand responsibility. This is why the legacy of these systems does not end with regime change. Flags can be lowered, leaders can fall. But mental maps are far harder to dismantle. People may reject a government while retaining the categories it taught them. They may condemn crimes while still using the language that made those crimes imaginable. Education, when weaponized, outlives the state that weaponized it. This is also why open societies cannot afford to treat maps and textbooks as neutral by default. They are never neutral. Every choice of inclusion and omission carries weight. Every simplification teaches more than it admits. Every absence shapes perception as powerfully as presence. The danger is not that children will be taught falsehoods directly. The danger is that they will be taught frameworks in which falsehoods feel unnecessary to question. History does not need to be falsified completely to be controlled. It only needs to be arranged. Arranged so that complexity feels inconvenient. Arranged so that alternatives feel unnatural. Arranged so that the future appears already decided. The Nazi system shows us what happens when education stops being a space for inquiry and becomes infrastructure for obedience. It shows how easily ordinary tools, maps, textbooks, exams, can be turned into silent weapons. Not weapons that command violence, but weapons that make violence intelligible. This is why the most important defense against historical manipulation is not better slogans or louder rebuttals. It is friction, comparison, exposure to contradiction. The ability to say, this could be drawn differently, or this story could be told another way. As soon as a child learns that a map is an argument rather than a mirror, power loses one of its most reliable tools. The lesson of the Third Reich is not only about the past. It is a warning about the future. A warning that the most effective way to shape what people will accept tomorrow is to shape what they are taught to recognize today. Because when history is no longer remembered but printed, and when the printed version is never questioned, the future becomes easier to predict and far harder to stop.